Последний вопрос, Рубен. С кем ты планируешь провести свой следующий диалог?
Я очень надеюсь, что мне удастся поговорить с человеком, который меня учил макроэкономике, когда я был в Гарварде. И я вот очень надеюсь, поумнев, мы сможем поговорить с ним уже как на другом уровне.
Dear Ken, thanks a lot for agreeing to talk with me. It's been a while since you taught me macroeconomics, and there are a lot of interesting changes in the world since then.
Sure.
So that's what I wanted to talk about, the new challenges that came up in the recent years. And one of the big challenges that we are kind of expect to face, but are already facing it a little bit, is the rise of cryptocurrencies and how they will affect the monetary policy and put additional limits and challenges on the working of the central banks. So I would really want to hear your opinion. What are the main challenges? What is the future of cryptocurrencies?
I think cryptocurrency has some interesting technologies. There's a lot going on in the digital space, but narrowly speaking, what people think of as Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, I don't think they have a long-term future, and I don't think they'll affect monetary policy, because I think regulation will come in. The issues like money laundering, tax evasion, they have to obey the same rules and regulations as everything else. And I think once that falls into place, their liquidity will collapse and we won't see them. But the rise of digital currencies, potentially those that are not crypto, and certainly potentially central bank digital currencies, that's a big thing. And an even bigger issue is the challenge that tech presents to banks, because the future of finance is data, like many things. And the big tech firms are better at data than the banks, and the banks are very nervous about it. That's a big challenge to central banks.
One set of issue that you mentioned is like there currently only the private cryptocurrency exists, and when we talk about cryptocurrencies, they are private ones. So the future, if I got it right from your answer, is that there are much more potential we could expect of rise of cryptocurrencies related to central banks. But what about this technology aspect of central banks and competition between different central banks in the world?
So it's not impossible, but it's not easy to see what's going on. Chinese are issuing a digital currency. It's what's called a permissioned currency that has this central part that knows everything. Initially, the Chinese have it only for domestic use, but it clearly is aimed eventually at taking a larger market share. That poses challenges, because it's much easier to cross borders. You can do it in quantity. I don't think, if we back up a second, I don't think it's going to be easy to challenge the dollar. That's going to take time. There have been so many predictions that the dollar would become less important, the euro would become important, the RMB would become important. And in fact, exactly the opposite has happened. I had a paper with Ethan Ilzitsky and Carmen Reinhardt in a very recent Quarterly Journal of Economics, talking about just the rise of the dollar and how many countries peg to the dollar. Just being digital doesn't really change that. However, having a state permission digital currency does open up competition in certain spheres, and also a big advantage that China has over say a private digital currency is they can guarantee you can use it somewhere. You can use it in the world's first or second biggest economy. And a private currency, if the US bans it and other countries ban it, there's no place to use it. Of course, you can use it for buying drugs or hire an assassination person, but it's very illiquid. But if China is saying, we will treat the digital RMB exactly like we treat the paper RMB and other things in our system, that gives it tremendous liquidity. It still doesn't push out the dollar for the larger global economy. As the Chinese economy grows, as Chinese capital markets deepen, provide a base on which maybe to challenge the dollar, but that is a long time off.
So for now, we can be relatively secure a dollar will still be dollar.
We can definitely be, I would definitely never say, but yeah, the dollar has paradoxically, even as the US economy gets to be a smaller and smaller share of the world, the dollar is a bigger and bigger share of global bonds, global exchange rate pegs, global, what people fix their prices to just across everything, central bank reserves. But I still say it's quite significant having state digital currencies, especially from a really big economy that can guarantee liquidity.
So a challenge to central banks recently comes in developed countries, especially, comes from like a new wave of populism that challenges what generally is considered to be one of the great achievements of macroeconomics, the independence of central banks. So do you think this is like a very temporary phenomenon that is just like post-crisis realignment of political forces, or it's like this is something that is here to stay and we may see this kind of backtracking and the independence of central banks, is it really at a serious threat?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I wrote a paper recently, is this the beginning of the end of central bank independence? I don't think it is, but we may see individual countries where it happens. Having central bank independence has probably been the single most successful macroeconomic policy since Keynes in terms of providing stabilization, growth. At least I think that's what the vast majority of economists believe. It's worked in many ways. It's tamed inflation, it's stabilized inflation. So say having independent central banks has provided a locus of technocratic expertise that's been more broadly useful in the government. But there are threats to this from both sides. There are people who love central bank independence, and they say, well, fiscal policies run so badly, why don't we push some of that onto the central bank? That is a very dangerous idea. Helicopter money is an example, and my friend Ben Bernanke has tentatively raised that issue from time to time, where you just give out money to people. But the thing is, you can't have unelected officials, technocrats, making decisions about who to give money to. You don't have, the central bank doesn't have the political legitimacy. And there are many, many policies where they want the central bank, people want the central bank to do it, and I think it's deeply misguided. It would end central bank independence. Then there's a whole nother view in the United States, modern monetary theory, where they basically want to reabsorb the central bank into the government and use it as an engine of printing money to pay for social programs and to redistribute income. I'm all in favor of social programs. I think we need to redistribute income more in the United States, but let's tax people who have higher incomes and transfer the money to have lower incomes. The idea that printing money is a free lunch, this has been tried in many Latin American countries, in Turkey, probably Israel. Many, many countries have tried modern monetary theory, and it actually works for a while, but then eventually ends up not only with high inflation and a crisis, you end up with lower real wages than you started with. So, but there's a conversation about this.
So you've raised this important issue about the accountability to public, actually, eventually, whether it's elected or unelected, people who make the decision. But surprisingly, it looks like the independence of central bank, if you look at it across the world, it was very successful regardless of the political system of the country.
So that is a very important point, and I have to say I hadn't expected it. So I think I wrote the first paper on central bank independence, at least the first theory model, my 1985 Quarterly Journal of Economics paper. And when I wrote it, really only a couple countries, the US, Germany, had an independent central bank. And I had a very difficult time getting it published. I got it rejected almost in return mail at the Journal of Political Economy, the American Economic Review, Review of Economic Studies. And the comment was always the same, saying, well, this is just a facade. If the government ultimately doesn't want the central bank to be independent, they'll walk all over it, and it can't work. And they were talking about advanced countries. And in fact, not only has it worked phenomenally well in advanced countries, but it has worked surprisingly well in emerging markets, where it's been a factor in helping to tame inflation. But it's central bank independence is different in different countries. Certainly in Russia in 2015, I wouldn't say you had an independent central bank in the way the United States does. It's a different system of government. But the central bank was phenomenally successful in dealing with the crisis that looked like you were going to have another 1998. It looked like you were going to have another full-blown financial crisis. And I think it didn't happen because the central bank very courageously let the exchange rate move, work to stabilize inflation. They got a lot of criticism from your president publicly. He must have supported it privately, but it's been very successful. One marker of that is certainly Elvira Nabiullina won Central Banker of the Year. Who would have imagined the Central Banker of the Year would come from Russia? And that helped earn space for the central bank, although I still wouldn't regard Russia's central bank as being as independent as, say, the US or the ECB.
Although recently there were actually some worries about independence of US.
Well, okay, but
at least like in sense of reacting to the speeches of the president.
But our president has a lot less power than your president, at least
for sure.
For this.
Like, it's all relative to.
Yes.
I really wanted to touch on another really big issue, which Russia is also a big player, which has to do with everything that has to do with environmental change, and how we deal with this problem, especially at the international level, because a lot of the issues they're completely unsolvable by a single country. That really requires a lot of inter-country cooperation. What do you see like as the main challenges there, and what are them? Because clearly there are conflicts of interest between developed and developing countries. How do you see how we can overcome these difficulties and solve this issue?
Well, virtually all economists, maybe it's an exaggeration, but a huge majority of economists think that the only way forward in the long run is a global carbon tax, not a complex system of quantity restrictions, but literally a global carbon tax that creates a similar price. It taxes the externality. Doesn't seem like the cost would actually end up being that great, and that would solve the problem.
But politically, that doesn't fly, as we see.
No, politically it doesn't fly, and I've certainly said that to political leaders, and their eyes glaze over, and they see it. They don't like to hear that word. But I think we will get there. I think it's the only long-term solution, and we'll eventually get there. But it's certainly a difficult piece of this is that the advanced countries are no longer the biggest source of global carbon emissions. Asia is, by and large. But cumulatively, they created the problem. And so to suddenly say to poor Asian countries, well, we created this situation, you have to help solve it, especially when you look at some of the challenges they face. Asian countries have very new coal plants. They just built them. They built lots and lots of coal plants. And the average age of a coal plant in Asia is something like 12 years. In the US, in advanced countries, it's something like 44 years. And the life expectancy of a coal plant is only 50 years or 60 years. So for us to say, oh, we're just going to phase out coal, it's nothing. Whereas in Asia, if they phase it out, they're huge costs. I think we need some form of accommodation, transfer. I've proposed a World Carbon Bank as an idea of trying to help with this problem. But it is a massive problem. I think one of the couple big problems of our time.
Okay, so thanks a lot for talking about these really global questions. And my last question is to you: with whom do you want to talk on the next edition of these dialogues?
Well, I think the way this works, I can't ask you because I might have indeed been very interested. I had you as a student at Harvard, and I'd be interested in everything you've learned since. But I actually would love to talk to Vladimir Mao, who I met in 2015 and had many interesting ideas, and I'd like an update of to see what he thinks now.
Great, thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.